Hegel's position on war has always been difficult for his adherents, or I should say, it's kept some of his would-be adherents as would-be adherents instead of actual ones, because rather than dreaming of perpetual peace like Kant does, in a way that I think a lot of people find appealing, Hegel argues for the social necessity of war, and this is something that people who are familiar with Hegel are pretty well aware of. And his idea is that people in a society lose their sense of the totality as they become mired in their private interests, and war forces them to concern themselves with the society as a whole, to confront the universality that makes their particular existence possible. So, as a result, Hegel, for war, Hegel has an ethical status. So, when one encounters Hegel's views on war, it comes off like something might hear from a right wing philosopher, not someone I would consider a revolutionary thinker on the side of emancipation. And I almost say it plays a central role in the opprobrium that surrounds the name Hegel, or at least surrounds it, or did surround it in most of the 20th century. So for someone like Karl Popper, uh, Hegel's view on war aligns him more with Carl Schmitt than with uh, someone on the left. So along with Hegel, Carl Schmitt believes that war represents a political necessity for the state. So for Schmitt, politics depends upon the distinction between friend and enemy, which will necessarily lead to war on occasion. And without this omnipresent threat of war, Schmitt thinks political struggle disappears. So life can remain interesting, but it would lose the antagonism that makes it meaningful. So this political distinction between friend and enemy gives a significance to our lives that it otherwise wouldn't have. Or you might say, without something to die for, we don't have anything to live for. I don't think Schmitt ever says that, but he should have said that, because that's his position. So Hegel's investment in war, I think, is related to Schmitt's, but clearly distinct. And their investment in the productivity of war's destructivity comes from, interestingly, a shared suspicion of bourgeois society, although Schmitt's suspicion is from the right and Hegel's is from the left. So Hegel doesn't, unlike Schmitt, he doesn't see this need for an enemy, which is the figure that really pushes Schmitt's thinking. For Hegel, the benefit of war lies in how it brings universality to the fore. So, according to Hegel, its universality, not the existence of an existential conflict with an enemy that becomes endangered during long periods of peace. So war reminds subjects that universality trumps their particularity and even the worth of their particular lives. So when the state demands that I risk my life to defend it, I recognize the nothingness of my own particularity relative to the universality that even allows it to emerge. So war's challenge to rampant particularism is a challenge for Hegel to capitalism's dominance of the modern epoch. And I think this is what makes Hegel's champion of war a radical rather than a reactionary act, even though it hasn't been judged that way. So as Hegel sees it, without war, the logic of capitalism plays a determinative role in the psyche of the modern subject, and war interrupts this determination by yanking people out of their particularity into an awareness of the universality that capital relations of production cannot encompass. So Hegel's greatest fear about modern society is that the demands of the capitalist economy will have the last word. So bourgeois or civil society, this is Hegel's term is bürgerliche Gesellschaft, uh, constantly threatens to overrun the power of the state. Modern society is always on the brink, Hegel believes, of becoming an unbridled capitalist society. And when this occurs, there's no check on the rampant inequality that the structure of this society unleashes. In such a situation, the self-interest of the particular would overrun all concern for the universal, and the social bond would collapse. To stave off this possibility that Hegel thinks is constantly there in modernity, states have recourse to war. And in his view, war is a kind of a bulwark against the unleashing of particularity that coincides with the dominance of capitalism. So modern society has a tendency to isolate people in their own particular identity. They go about their everyday lives without any awareness of the collective background that makes this everyday existence possible. And this lack of awareness Hegel thinks has a deleterious effect on the social arrangement because this arrangement does not exist on its own, but sustains itself through people's constant investment in it. And in the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel articulates this unleashing of particularism that occurs during peacetime in this way. He says, in order to let them become rooted and rigidly fixed within this activity of isolating themselves, which would otherwise let the whole come undone and the spirit within it fade away, the government must from time to time shake them to their core by means of war. As a result, it infringes, that is, the government, infringes on their established order, violates their right to self sufficiency, and throws them into disarray. He thinks those are all good things. Without war, or at least the constant possibility of it, a false isolation infects everyone in society. So people begin to feel self sufficient. They lose sight of the constitutive role that the state plays in their subjectivity. I think, as this line of thinking suggests, Hegel's defense of war is inextricable from his critique of the liberal capitalist order, and I think it indicates his investment in the project of emancipation. So if civil society overruns the state, then people lose themselves in the isolation, the particularism of capitalist subjectivity. And this is the supreme danger of modern society. And when people lose sight of the constitutive status of the state, they cease to invest themselves in anyone around them. They become isolated monads. We lose a sense of the public. And against this background, war asserts the priority of the state and lets us know the state provides a collective background for everything we do as individuals. For Hegel, the state, contra Marx, of course, the state's not just a tool of capitalist society, it actually functions as a brake on capitalism's power and a means of fighting against capitalism's proclivity for ensconcing everyone in their own self-interested position. So without the state, civil society, capitalism would unleash a world with nothing but particulars, and universality would disappear. It'd be impossible to discern it. And so war, in a way, reveals that self-interest doesn't have the last word. But Hegel's not just a bellicist. He has a cogent theoretical explanation for his investment in war. At the same time, I think Hegel's proximity to Schmitt on this question should give us a little bit of pause, especially because they both see war in the same way as this antidote to the depredations of bourgeois society. So Hegel defends war from the left, Schmitt from the right, but there's this overlap that indicates to me that there's something a bit amiss about Hegel's position. So fundamentally, Hegel and Schmitt are opposed thinkers, but in this way, Schmitt's conservative philosophy depends on this rigid opposition between inside and outside, friend enemy. Hegel's philosophical breakthrough is what makes this distinction impossible to sustain, because it's about how an identity only finds itself in its other. It doesn't constitute itself through an external opposition, but instead, sorry, uh, but instead through its difference from itself. So for Hegel, identity is itself what differentiates identity is what differentiates itself from itself, or as he puts it in Science of Logic, the truth is complete only in the unity of identity and difference. So an identity formed simply through the distinction from what it isn't is necessarily one-sided and false. And I think it ends up falling apart as an identity through its implicit reliance on an otherness that it distinguishes itself from but doesn't acknowledge its dependence on. I think this is the basic problem with what takes place during war. So war inevitably establishes an opposition between identity and what's other to the identity enemy. And the tactics of war prevent anyone on either side from grasping what Hegel calls very nicely, I think, the speculative identity between both sides. And there's a precise name for those who claim identity, speculative or not, with the enemy, and that name is treason. So during wartime, the philosopher who grasps the truth of speculative identity would be intrinsically guilty of giving aid and comfort to the enemy, right? So to grasp the identity of identity and difference, is Hegel's great formulation, forces one to see oneself in the enemy, which is exactly what the exigencies of war prohibit. So while there are times one has to fight a war, for a speculative thinker, or for the Hegelian thinker, for Hegel, it must always be a last resort, I think, due to the damage that it does to the project of speculation. So, from Hegel's own theoretical perspective, one has to argue against Hegel, I think, on the issue of war. So, Hegel's insistence on the philosophical and political necessity of war, I want to claim, runs counter to the basic tenor of his thought, this speculative identity between identity and difference. So war creates an external opposition between two conflicting powers, but Hegel himself never, ever, ever respects external oppositions as really just external. When he confronts an external opposition between two disparate claims, his philosophical gesture always consists in uncovering how each side has a dependence on the other, or the external opposition houses an internal contradiction. So he sees the way in which the external opposition has an obfuscatory effect. It lures us to focus on the visible opposition so that we miss the internal contradiction that undermines its position. So, despite the clear insights, I think, into the revelatory dimension of war, Hegel misses how undialectical war actually is. War sinks us into a mindless dualism, which is why I want to say we should do whatever we can to avoid it. If war is a philosophical necessity, we aren't being philosophical enough. So Hegel's argument on the necessity of war, as I have said, is an anti-capitalist one, even if he doesn't put it this way. When I unthinkingly submerge myself in daily existence, I lose track of capitalism's structural determinations. My particular concerns become paramount, and all these banal concerns of my daily life fit comfortable into capitalist society. It's easy to become a good capitalist subject. So capitalism depends upon everyone being ensconced in an unthinking privacy. And I think for Hegel, precisely the appeal of war, there's a disruption that shakes us out of our investment in doing your job, earning a profit. And what war does is reveal the nothingness of that. And that's for Hegel, its radical dimension. So I think it's interesting, though, despite Hegel's status as one of the great comic philosophers, maybe the greatest, uh, maybe there's a couple of rivals living, he doesn't seem to get a crucial joke about capitalism and war. And this is perhaps because he lived prior to the birth of the military industrial complex. So here's how the joke goes. Someone asks, the 20-year-long war in Afghanistan just ended. Who won? And the response, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Blackwater, and Lockheed Martin. So it's a pretty good joke, I think. It's one of those jokes that's maybe a little not as good because it's a little too true. So the joke, I think, nicely communicates that I have another Hegel joke that I'm saving for the very end. The joke communicates the direct benefit that war provides for capitalism. It's just very obvious. It funds companies that supply all the weapons of war for the combatants. But I think there's even more important indirect benefits. So war provides a way for capitalist society to address an economic crisis when it arises. It not only takes the collective attention off our economic troubles, but the destructiveness provides a way out of an economic downturn. So when a mobilized war effort takes place, a country can put vast resources into completely useless activities like production of bombs, movement of troops, manufacture of equipment. And the key to this spending economically is that none of it is useful or productive. So it's all geared toward destruction, which means, of course, that there's no upper limit on how much can be allotted for it, unlike something that's spent toward a public good. So war is an anti-capitalist enterprise insofar as it strips me of my sham isolation and forces me to confront the role that the collective plays in supporting my existence. But the part that war plays in generating and saving capitalism is, I think, even more significant. And Hegel's lack of experience with the development of capitalism leaves him unable to take this quality of war into account when estimating its necessity. So he doesn't see how war comes to the rescue of a dying capitalism by providing just the destruction that it needs to rebuild itself. And given this salutary role that war plays for capitalism, it seems to me increasingly difficult, today at least, to accept Hegel's judgment on war. The other thing I don't think he accounts for is the effect of rallying around the flag. Schmitt likes this. He likes the fact that the war creates this uh, unity of the state. But I think for Hegel, it's a problem because nothing eliminates dissension like a good war. And I think this is maybe the most adverse consequence of war for the project of emancipation. And when Hegel praises the state for making people aware that the universal underwrites their subjectivity, I actually think this is an effect that disappears during war. So the state's existence makes clear not just the dependence of each individual on the collective structure, but also the contradiction that defines the collectivity. I think this is absolutely crucial, right? So it's not just the universal is not just this whole collective, it's also a collective riven by contradiction. And the contradiction appears in the form of the political struggles that find no possible resolution. So the political divide within any social order bespeaks the absence of any possible harmonious relations in society. But when war breaks out, what's interesting to me is that harmonious relations within the social order, they don't they don't become possible, but they seem possible. They all of a sudden it seems like, oh, we could have a social harmony. Like people say, remember when in the US, right after 9/11, everyone was so unified, right? Like that there you go, right? Like that to me is the perfect statement of that. So from a Hegelian perspective that Hegel himself fails to articulate, the great problem with war is that it misses the internal contradiction for an external opposition. That is, whereas Hegel's thought is constantly translating external oppositions into internal contradictions, war just reverses that. Takes an internal contradiction, manifests itself as an external opposition. When they're at war, societies seem free of internal contradiction. All the force of internal contradiction becomes directed at the enemy, which is why leaders often resort to war when they find their internal grip on power crumbling. One might hazard such an idea about the situation in Russia right now. During wartime, the popularity of political leaders almost inevitably increases. Rather than rebelling against hardships, the populace embraces the leader and the hardships as contributing to the war effort. And uh, Joseph Goebbels' totalitarian speech is the great example of this, I think. So a swell of national pride usually takes place that corresponds to the hatred of the enemy being fought. And at the same time, the experience of the social order's internal contradictions evanesces. So this is how I would put it. During war, the nation trumps the state. And I think Hegel doesn't make enough of this divide between nation and state. So Hegel correctly sees that individual particularity takes a back seat, and this is why he's sanguine about war. But individual particularity doesn't give way to an avowal of state power. Instead, it gives way to an idea of national unity. And so Hegel misidentifies, I think, the phenomenon because he doesn't fully differentiate between nation as a content and state as a form, which I think is a really important distinction to make. So wartime enables particular individuals to identify themselves unreservedly with the particularity of the nation, bypassing the universal structure of the state. And so when this happens, war expands particularity from the individual to the group rather than highlighting universality. So the state is a universal structure for Hegel because it's a totality that reveals the social necessity of contradiction. So one thinks the totality for Hegel so that one can grasp the ontological necessity of contradiction, not so that one can imagine the overcoming of contradiction in the state. I think this is very important. So the state is a site of totality because it's a site where contradiction manifests itself, which is why Hegel sees it as a radical form. So the particularity of the nation makes it more appealing as a site of identification, while the universality of the state actually undermines the national identification. So when Hegel argues for the necessity of war as a bulwark against rampant particularism, I think he underestimates the significance of this distinction between nation and state. So war empowers the nation at the expense of the state, and people's investment in the nation doesn't eliminate their particularism, it actually expands it. It makes it worse. It makes their particular identity explode. So war is a philosophical and political disaster, I want to say, especially for those engaged in emancipatory struggles. This is why reactionary leaders are constantly looking to start wars. like Putin, and radical leaders will take whatever steps they can do to end them. This is what Lenin did, right, in the end of World War One. So I think it's not coincidental, that contrast between those two. So the best argument in support of Hegel's position on war, I'm now going to take the other side briefly, comes from a contemporary thinker, Slavoj Zizek, who sees war as the manifestation of the internal contradiction within every social order. And it's important that Zizek often uses the term antagonism rather than contradiction, which I think allows him to make this shift between the internal and the external pretty more fluidly, I guess. So war doesn't occur naturally as a result of the conflicts between differently constituted people, according to Zizek. Instead, it breaks out due to the internal failure of every social order. So there's no social bond that escapes the negativity that would undermine it, just as there's no subject that can avoid the destructiveness of the death drive, in Zizek's way of thinking. So societies can't avoid a self-destructive negativity because it is simultaneously the bond that holds them together. So the very bond that holds us together is the thing that tears us apart, which is a little bit like love will tear us apart again. Then love will tear us apart again. So Zizek argues that this negativity appears not just within every social order, but also externally in the form of war. So war is the manifestation of an unmastered internal negativity that each society harbors. And then in Less Than Nothing, Zizek states, the function of what Hegel conceptualizes as the necessity of war is precisely the repeated untying of organic social links. So wars force us to confront that there's no possible guarantee for our social bond, no matter how democratically or equally we establish a social order, it will always have this inherent instability. At some point in time, the order will collapse. And the threat of war is how this inherent collapsibility, inherent finitude of the social order becomes evident. So the state's internal contradictions render it vulnerable to attack. They make external conflicts with other states possible. So war is, as Zizek, I think, rightfully puts it, the ultimate proof that no organic social order can effectively contain the force of abstract universal negativity. The internal failure of the social order, in other words, manifests itself in the constant threat of war. Every social order is vulnerable to attack because it's internally inconsistent, just as Hegel thinks an apple can be eaten due to its own self-division that constitutes it as edible. Like if an apple wasn't self-divided, Hegel believes no one could eat one. So there has to be some vulnerability in the apple that allows us to eat it. So in other words, no one could eat an apple that wasn't at first edible. And no one can attack a society that's not in some way vulnerable to attack through its internal negativity, which is not a way of blaming the victim for the attack. It's just saying there has to be a vulnerability for someone to be attacked. So since no social order can master the negativity that nonetheless requires, this contradiction ultimately spells doom for even the most securely structured social arrangement. So the problem with war, I want to say, is that it's a fundamentally deceptive form of appearance. The external conflicts that take place during war do not have the effect of highlighting the internal contradictions, even if Slavoj Zizek is able to recognize this process at work. So Zizek sees it. I don't think people involved see it. So in the heat of battle, no one sees the relationship between internal negativity and external vulnerability. In fact, it's the opposite. It becomes completely obfuscated. The war unfailingly has the effect of hiding the internal contradictions by focusing all attention on the external opposition. So when I'm caught up in a war, no one sees the self-relating negativity that undermines the social order from within. Instead, they focus on the enemy that threatens it externally. So war doesn't emerge, in other words, due to the presence of competing states without an arbiter to decide on the law that would govern all. That's, I think, a standard idea of war. It stems instead from the internal contradiction of each state, its inability to constitute a totality without contradiction, what Zizek calls a abstract universal negativity that undermines it. The problem is that rather than exposing the social order's abstract universal negativity, internal failure, war allows everyone to look externally for the source of the destructiveness. And I think it fools even the most circumspect political thinkers. Hegel makes a radical case for the necessity of war. And I think that's why some of his most perspicacious interpreters today continue to support his position. Shlomo Avineri is another one, Zizek, there's others. Uh, but I think the intervening years have shown that the support of war is a position better honored in the breach than in the observance, to cite Hamlet, talking about his uncle. During his time, I shouldn't have compared Hegel to Claudius, but okay. During his time, his historical period, historical moment, I think Hegel could convincingly view war as a project that interrupted the particularist logic of capitalism. Today, however, I think it's evident that this is not the case. The problem is not that war has become increasingly horrible after Hegel's death, but the taking up arms is now clearly revealed as a defense of the capitalist status quo. And yet, Hegel does have a crucial insight into the way that war disrupts the isolated particularism that threatens the modern world. What Hegel didn't see is that there are alternatives to war that do what he envisions war doing. So I think Hegel rightly grasps that we need some vehicle for promulgating the universal in an epoch of runaway particularism. That seems to me just utterly self-evident from an emancipatory perspective. But there are less misleading institutions than war, I believe. For instance, one could imagine a requirement for public service that rips people out of their isolation in the way that war does, without spurring nationalist pride, without rescuing the capitalist economy, and without hiding society's contradictions. So universal public service would break up the reign of privacy by introducing an irrevocable duty and yet not creating this opposition between friend and enemy. And I think this is the dimension of war that leads to Hegel's investment in it. And universal public service gives the lie to particularism without giving rein to jingoism. It seems safe to say, I think, that no one ever felt a swell of nationalist pride while picking up garbage along the road or cleaning out public toilets, because he lives in an age. I think the service should be that undesirable. I would be, and I think I should be eligible for it, maybe the first in line. Because he lives in an age where such service would be unthinkable. He just couldn't, there wasn't garbage along the highway. Hegel doesn't see that there are alternatives that avoid the conformist consequences of war. The problem with war that Hegel misses is not that it's too violent, but that far too often it leaves things as they are. So war may be universalist, but it's not universalist enough. And this is why I want to say Hegel fails to be truly Hegelian when he champions the necessity of war. But whatever we might ultimately conclude, I do want to say I don't think Hegel's position on war is a disqualifier for championing Hegelian dialectics. Not only does it make sense within his own political and philosophical system, but it even holds up as part of leftist political theory, as someone like Zizek's defense of it makes clear. However, if we are to be true to the radical edge of Hegel's own thought, the identity of identity and difference, that formula I like so much, we should reconsider the insistence on the necessity of war. So even when it manifests a revolutionary negativity, war does so in a way that doesn't permit us to recognize it as the actual site of this negativity. It's only when war goes terribly wrong, when it brings a humiliating defeat rather than a glorious victory, that we can really recognize what Hegel is after. Only at this point do we see that the external opposition actually manifested an internal contradiction. While it's happening, however, war just mystifies. It's mystifying. For the sake of remaining true to Hegel's philosophical project, we should view war not as a political necessity, but as a last resort. To embrace the necessity of war is to accede to the obfuscation of internal contradiction.